Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Today we are talking about the latest that has evolved in the ongoing conflict that is unfolding in Indian-occupied Kashmir. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi strongly raised the humanitarian violations in Indian-occupied Kashmir during the 42nd session of the United Nations Human Rights Commission in Geneva. He said that the UN human rights watchdog should pressurize India to immediately lift the curfew in occupied Kashmir, to stop the use of pellet guns, end the bloodshed, and restore fundamental freedoms and liberties. India had a chance to reply, but what India media is calling a strong rebuttal to Pakistan's statement was Virmash Aryan, First Secretary in India's Ministry of External Affairs, lack of an answer to the dozens and dozens of evidence-backed incidents that have taken place in Indian-occupied Kashmir since August 5th. Reported by international media, all of which transcend well beyond any doubt that there are human rights violations unfolding there on a daily basis. So without further ado, let me introduce our guest who will be commenting on the latest development. We have with us former ambassador from Islamabad, Mr. Tariq Zamir. Welcome to Newswire once again. Ambassador, you heard the statements, you heard the news coverage, of course, of what unfolded in this 42nd session in Geneva. Do you feel like Pakistan's diplomacy or the push to highlight the affairs as they are in Indian-occupied Kashmir have finally hit home?
Thank you very much, Ayza. Yeah, I was following the events in Geneva. And one good thing is that, this statement on behalf of states that Pakistan delivered. If you read that statement, it has all the necessary elements, withdrawal of this kind of system that they have put in place of, by 30, it's the 37th day now that the Kashmiris are in a concentration camp. And also it refers to the UN Security Council resolutions and resolution of the Kashmir issue according to that. And then it speaks of alleviating the sufferings of the incarcerated 8 million Kashmiris. Mm-hmm. So that's a good thing. I would say that it should build up to something nice when our delegation goes to New York for the UNGA later this month.
So, Ambassador Zamir, the way India came back with their return statement and what Indian media is calling a very strong rebuttal to Pakistan over-dramatizing what is unfolding in Kashmir, how did you feel about India's version of it?
No, you see, Pakistan is not over-dramatizing. You read the international media as we do. We follow, stories in the New York Times and in USA Today and in the other British newspapers. Mm-hmm. It's not Pakistan that is dramatizing. It is India that has unleashed a reign of terror, and now they just want to cover it up with this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. They won't be able to do that. They have faced the music at various places, like in the European Commission, and now they will face this kind of criticism in UNGA also. So before that, they just want to sort of divert the attention and just to show that it's non-event. It's not. What they are doing there is absolutely against all international laws and all human norms also.
Now, here's the problem, Ambassador Zamir. While 50 countries, after Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi's address, backed and supported Pakistan's stance in highlighting the humanitarian crisis in Indian-occupied Kashmir on the hands of Prime Minister Modi and the BJP-led government, what we immediately saw, and this again rings like a true pattern from India, is a false flag operation news. Are you concerned that even though this incident has barely any standing of its own, I'm referring to the Sir Creek incident, would throw off the very purpose this meeting, this Kashmir issue was raised?
If you look at the history of just last 20 years, how India has, done these false flag operations. There is even a book written by a German. The name of the book is it's by Elias Davidson. And he has absolutely dissected the whole Bombay attack. Yes. Before that, if you remember, there was an attack on the Indian Parliament And that attack took place only 2 days before the visit of Bill Clinton to India. So they do these kind of things, to divert attention or to bring focus to Pakistan, to malign it. They tried to do the same thing in 2002 January during the SARC summit. In the run-up to the SARC summit, when President Musharraf had already taken off for Kathmandu, the Indians, they raided the house of one of our embassy colleagues with the help of some rogue elements in Kathmandu. And they tried to sort of, show it that Pakistan was involved in some kind of, Pakistan embassy was involved in some kind of nefarious activities. Luckily, that was stemmed on time. And otherwise, they wanted to, the moment the president would have landed there would have been such a big flash that Pakistan is doing this. But luckily, we were able to sort of, the embassy was able to take control of that, and the Indians didn't succeed in that. So they are good at that, to basically two motives. One, to create a smoke screen, divert attention from what they are doing in Kashmir, and then bring some bad focus in Pakistan. Indians are quite capable of doing these things. So if they do it, we should be ready for it, and we shouldn't be surprised at all.
We shouldn't be surprised, but the question really is, will the world be able to see it in the same light? Will be able to see through the kind of guise or the drama that India is seemingly prepared to unfold?
No, you see, the good thing is that we have been raising it to the media, and the government has been issuing statements that India might be creating a false flag operation. So that thing is going out again and again. So that's one good thing. And I'm sure that must be on the basis of some tangible intelligence information.
Right.
Well, God forbid if there is something like this, if they go for a false flag operation, there are people like Indians. They have their friends who will make noise. But then the point is, there is also independent media. And we have been raising it, and we have been openly saying it, that India can do that.
Now, when the US President Donald Trump just 2 days ago came back and said, well, I'm still here if you need mediation on the Kashmir issue. Now, the timing seems really significant, also considering that he's either just fired or his national security advisor has resigned, since that's an ongoing dispute, has just happened. What do you make of President Trump coming back from that statement he gave when Prime Minister Modi met with him, where he said, well, it's a bilateral issue?
You see, we shouldn't be having high hopes from this kind of statements, that he said this and that, because these statements, this U.S. president has so many things on his plate. Right. And I'll be extremely surprised, or pleasantly surprised, if he had all the information that he needs to have about Kashmir to understand the issues, from 1947 onwards. So these statements, they come at times, and then we shouldn't sort of get carried away by these statements. Fine, it's a statement. Right. Unless you see something positive on the ground, unless you see that the United States is pressing India to improve the human rights situation in Jammu and Kashmir, we shouldn't take them very, very seriously.
But then I still have to ask you, Ambassador Zamir, about the kind of statements that are coming from the human rights chief herself, Ms. Michelle Bachelet, regarding the kind of impact that this is having, this communication blackout, the curfew, she expressing concern that India should pull back, should remove the curfew. And also when Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi met on the sidelines, the UN chief. So do you think any of this will have the kind of effect that is badly needed at this time for the Kashmiris?
Yes, that's right. These are the kind of statements that are important. If UN Human Rights Chief says something, and she said it sort of categorically, those are important statements. So anything coming from, these people, like, for instance, Amnesty International, Amnesty in India, they blasted Indian government for that. Well, Amnesty is different, but then UN Human Rights Chief is definitely, her statement is very, very important.
All right, Ambassador Zamir, thank you so much for taking out the time to talk to us about the 42nd session at the UNHRC that took place yesterday, where the Kashmir issue was raised. But now we'll take a quick short break. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. So John Bolton is out, the national security advisor, I should add. The former national security advisor was thrown out or has resigned. That is still being disputed. However, what is confirmed is that there have been many disagreements between U.S. President Donald Trump and Mr. John Bolton's way of dealing with national security. Earlier this year, just to cite a few examples, according to various news reports, President Donald Trump was furious with Mr. Bolton on the failure of U.S. policy in Venezuela. President Trump had complained that Bolton had misled him about how easy it would be to replace the president, Nicolas Maduro, there. Also, on several incidents, President Trump has once even joked in an Oval Office meeting where he said Mr. Bolton was quite the warmonger, saying that he has never seen John not like a war. So Mr. Bolton, seen as a hawkish figure and a strong supporter and architect of the Iraq war, has opposed peace talks with the Taliban, which Mr. Trump had scrapped at the last moment. In fact, 3 days before 9/11 commemorations began in the United States, the secret meeting was to be held at Camp David in the U.S. between President Trump, the Taliban, and the Afghan president. Now, Mr. Bolton had no sort of compromising strategy towards Iran also. Even with Afghanistan, he had issues, and North Korea. The way he approached it was very different from what we hear that President Donald Trump approached it. So without further ado, let me introduce our guest. We'll be hashing out for us what this essentially means. The third national security advisor, after a 17-month tenure, leaves. And what does this mean for the key issues that U.S. is involved in across the globe? So we have with us today Mr. Ahmed Murid Partaw, a former Republican, joining us from the U.S. And also we have from Taipei, Mr. Ross Feingold, analyst and political analyst. Welcome to both of you to the show. I want to start with you, Mr. Feingold, right off the bat on how you see John Bolton leaving at this critical time.
Well, it shows that the boss ultimately is the president of the United States. He takes advice from a number of different foreign policy or national security military advisors, whether it's the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, or the National Security Advisor. But President Trump makes the final decisions, and that's the way the system should, and it does work. So he may have listened to John Bolton's opinions on a number of issues, but President Trump made the decisions that President Trump believes are ultimately in the best interest of the United States. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that John Bolton should depart. They're entitled to disagree. President Trump is probably better served by having team members with slightly different opinions, but it's clear that there were some personality issues as well, and that they were no longer having a fruitful relationship. And as Secretary of State Pompeo said in the press conference in Washington with Secretary of Treasury Mnuchin, that the national security advisor serves at the president at the pleasure of the president, can be fired, relieved of his duties at any time, and that's what happened.
But Mr. Feingold, this is the third one in Donald Trump's tenure to have lost this job. Is this job doomed to fail?
It will certainly give critics more to talk about. They'll of course say that this shows a lack of stability in the foreign policy and national security team. I don't think that's necessarily supported by the facts. I mean, certainly there's been a high amount of personnel turnover in the White House and the other cabinet level agencies, including the State Department and the Defense Department. But when it comes to policy continuity, I mean, given that President Trump is the one who makes the final decisions, we don't actually see policy turning left and right rapidly. So when it comes to North Korea, for example, there were tensions in 2017, and President Trump was at the forefront of using strong language. But then in 2018, he was at the forefront of reducing tensions. Similar with the negotiations with the Taliban, even though National Security Advisor Bolton had opposed that. The negotiations were proceeding up until recently, and the reason why the negotiations have stalled were the actions of the Taliban more so than disagreements between Bolton, Pompeo, and President Trump.
All right. And so, Mr. Ahmed Murid Partaw, first of all, my apology introducing you incorrectly. Let me correct that. Mr. Ahmed Murid Partaw, you're the former senior national representative of Afghanistan to U.S. Central Command, and you've worked in different capacities for the Afghan government also. Mr. Murid, what's your take on we're not even discussing, though, how John Bolton might have left at this critical juncture. But what does this mean, especially when it comes to just the U.S.-Taliban of talks and where they were at this critical time?
I think it's not going to make any difference in policy issues because the ultimate decision maker based on the presidential system is President Trump. Moreover, Mr. Bolton was sidelined from policy decisions even before that. So I don't think the departure of Mr. Bolton is going to make a huge difference on Afghanistan because again it's the president who makes the ultimate decision. However, Afghanistan may be related to one of the aspects of the disagreement between the president and his National Security Council, but it's not going to make a huge difference.
It's not make a huge difference. Something also what Mr. Feingold was saying, but considering the situation here, it is, of course, the president, the U.S. president is the supreme leader. He makes the final call here. But what happened in Camp David? The announcement came that the meeting was scrapped right when there was an understanding that there was an agreement in principle. We have an understanding from various reports that John Bolton was actually against this meeting in the first place.
I think the canceled Camp David meeting would have offered both sides a chance for peace, especially the Afghan government and the Taliban leadership, because the Afghan president was also invited for the meeting. So that would have been a momentous occasion if it had occurred. But still there were disagreements between the Taliban and the United States. Right. I'm hearing that the U.S. had offered the Taliban the invitation to Camp David now, but it was the Taliban who didn't accept this invitation. The invitation had been supposedly rejected by the Taliban Shura or Council, and the Taliban were arguing that the agreement should be signed in one of the Gulf countries, maybe.
Right. I mean, from the reaction of the Taliban, it was rather confusing who could have been behind exactly this cancellation or leading to this cancellation. But coming back to you, Mr. Feingold, Mr. John Bolton and Trump didn't agree a lot on how they approached North Korea. And it's ironic because it seems like Kim Jong-un has pretty much mastered the Trump way of dealing with the kind of with national security issues, that after just a few hours, he oversaw the second largest sort of launch of these super huge rockets in North Korea.
Well, there's two schools of thought with regard to where we stand with North Korea. President Trump and Secretary of State Pompeo and others in the Trump administration will continue to focus on the cessation of the more extreme provocative actions by North Korea. And that's obviously long-range missile tests and nuclear tests. And they'll talk about ongoing negotiations. Yes, they've been off and on, but they have occurred. There was repatriation of war remains. There are the meetings. There is the detente with South Korea. So it would be unfair to criticize President Trump's approach as not having had some outcomes. And then the other way to look at this is to say that there's been no grand deal. We can't verify that North Korea has truly stopped its nuclear weapons research programs, and they continue to do some of these more minor provocative actions. But does that mean that the Trump administration's overall approach is incorrect? Well, I think whether they're Democrats or Republicans in the United States, most people are generally supportive of having some kind of dialogue. And speaking here from East Asia, I think governments in this part of the world are also supportive of having a dialogue and wouldn't want to see no dialogue. So it's only going to be a minority of people that'll take the view that either we shouldn't be talking or it's been a total failure. Obviously, John Bolton was a big proponent very stringent sanctions, and that's something that the Trump administration continues to implement. Would Bolton support the multiple rounds of summits or another summit? Maybe not, but again, as we've been talking with the other parts of the world, this decision is ultimately up to President Trump.
This is up to President Trump, right? But Mr. Murid, just talking about how Mr. John Bolton had a sort of had supported the Iraq war, had always been for regime change, and as Mr. Feingold mentioned, sanctions. We've seen that the U.S.-Iran situation has come to an impasse based on these stringent maneuvering. What is your take on the situation now? Do you think there's a possibility that President Trump would come to the table, considering his recent remarks?
Come to the table back with the Taliban, you mean? Or
with Iran on trying to renegotiate a deal with the JCPOA?
With Iran, I don't think so. That should be the case because there's still, divergent views between the two sides, the Iranian and the United States. And the U.S. has made sure that if they want to talk, on U.S. terms, they can reach out to President Trump and Trump administrations. But I don't think the Iranians are ready to do that. They say that.
Mr. Feingold, in your opinion, with Mr. John Bolton gone now, how do you see Iran and U.S. moving forward?
Well, we should never exclude the possibility that Donald Trump will meet with the Iranian leadership. He likes the grand, dramatic gesture. He likes being in front of the cameras and doing the unexpected. And that's worked well for President Trump as far as building a narrative of his own foreign policy successes, as he would define them, with Kim Jong-un of North Korea. So if there was a repeat of that, something similar with Iran, of course, we shouldn't be surprised by that. And there are going to be advisors inside the government of the United States, or now somebody like John Bolton, who's going to be on TV commenting about these issues as he was before he became national security advisor. And they'll say things like, President Trump, if you're going to meet with Iran, here are the things you should be asking for. So again, the option comes down to don't meet at all, don't have any dialogue, or have a dialogue, but make your demands face to face. And I think few people would say just, have no dialogue at all. But ultimately, whether they could proceed, I would say whether it's a John Bolton or a Mike Pompeo, they probably have more similarities than differences in that they would outline a number of steps that Iran has to take in order to have a new JCPOA or reduce tensions in the overall relationship. And they're going to say the onus is on Iran. It's not on the United States.
But some analysts are arguing that the timing is such that one would expect the President Trump to make a movement more encouraging, more forward thinking than what he has already after the Israeli elections take place. Do you agree with that analysis?
Well, President Trump probably doesn't look at one event like that for determining whether he will meet with Iran. There's the UN meeting. If the Iranian leadership attends the UN meeting, President Trump attends the UN meeting, they can meet. They can meet very easily in New York City on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. And the Israeli elections are kind of irrelevant to something like that. There could be other events in the Middle East region. Again, something that happens in the Persian Gulf area that might impact the bilateral relationship. President Trump is not necessarily going to let that dictate when or whether he meets with Iran. So ultimately, President Trump will do this meeting if the Iranians agree, but I would expect President Trump to be a tough negotiator once they get in the room. That being said, we also know that President Trump, when he meets with people who might seem to be adversaries of the United States, he often praises those leaders. He says, look, this person is a great leader.
Right, we saw that with Kim Jong-un. Hold that thought, Mr. Feingold. Introduce Mr. Abbas Aslani, political analyst joining us from Iran. Mr. Aslani, we're talking about essentially that now that Mr. John Bolton is gone, somebody who is recognized as looking for a regime change in Iran, and with the current standoff between U.S. and Iran, my question to Mr. Feingold was, I want to ask you this also. Do you think it would be a significant change of policy or tactics after the Israeli elections?
First we need to see that why John Bolton was fired from the office. I think the differences among Trump and Bolton existed on different issues. If you can look at the issue of the North Korea, then Iran, and then Venezuela, and the last, which was let's say the main important challenge between Trump and Bolton on the talks between the United States with Taliban of Afghanistan. So it seems that the approaches that Donald Trump has had have been mostly into negotiations with all those countries or parties involved in these issues, including North Korea. Trump wanted to have negotiations, but John Bolton opposed that on the Venezuelan issue, on the Iran issue, and as well as the talks with Taliban. It seems that Trump has been into negotiations while Bolton has opposed them. So I think what will happen in future depends on who will replace him. And it doesn't mean that necessarily someone will come and everything will improve in relation with Iran or in relation to other countries. And that depends on who is nominated to replace him. And I think Bolton is a person in an administration, and problems cannot be resolved overnight by changing a person. That will depend on lots of issues which needs to happen in the United States administration.
Right. So, Mr. Murid, while changes cannot come in policy overnight, as Mr. Aslani pointed out, with the change of a person in the National Security Advisor, for example. But at the same time, we know for a fact that he was pretty much Mr. Bolton's sideline during these meetings with the Taliban, the negotiations. It was really the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who had the front seat here, who's behind the steering wheel, essentially. But it really still brings in the question that could this be any excuse or a reason behind a change in how they would approach the Afghanistan problem? Because it is 2020 elections coming up. He is campaigning. He needs to withdraw troops from there.
Well, the negotiations with the Afghan Taliban are led by the State Department, not the National Security Council. During all these 9 to 10 months, the direct negotiations with Mr. Zalmay Khalilzad being the chief negotiators from the United States side has been led directly by Department of State, which, as you mentioned, the National Security Council was not that heavily involved in this regard. It remains to be seen who is going to be replacing Mr. Bolton in the future, and see the role of the future National Security Advisor on Afghanistan issues. First of all, we don't know who is going to replace him. Maybe someone who has experience with Afghanistan, who was direct influence, who will have direct influence in this respect. That remains to be seen. But at present, Mr. Pompeo, U.S. Secretary of State, has the authority from President Trump to lead the negotiations with the Afghan Taliban.
Right. No, I understand what you're saying there, that at the end of the day, it's not the National Security Advisor who's calling the calling the shots here. But Mr. Feingold, coming back to the situation in the Middle East, where the U.S. is currently embroiled in the standoff with Iran. Now, the reason I asked you about the Israeli elections essentially was because of what we've seen, and is not sort of unique, it is not unprecedented, of the kind of military tensions escalating on part of Israelis. And I'm here referring to what they're facing with Lebanon, with Hezbollah, in terms of drone strikes, drones being shot down.
Well, the interesting thing there to keep in mind is, regardless of John Bolton being in or out of the job, whoever replaces him, Secretary of State Pompeo, other defense or foreign policy officials in the Trump administration, the relationship between Israel and the United States is very strong. If Netanyahu's coalition loses the election and is replaced by a more centrist government, it's not really going to change the nature of the very strong relationship. So again, whether Iran is willing to meet with the Trump administration or the leadership to meet with President Trump, it's probably going to operate on a separate track from events in Israel or Israel's periphery, whether it's Gaza or Lebanon. And this is just part of the parties, the United States and Iran, willing to come to a meeting with no preconditions. But again, if they actually have that meeting, I would expect President Trump not to concede much to Iran. And bringing up Israel, from the Iranian side is probably not going to be conducive to having a productive negotiation as far as the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Iran.
Okay, stay with us, Mr. Feingold. Mr. Aslani, your take on this in terms of moving forward, the kind of tensions that Israel has created with 3 different countries, 3 different attacks, and now facing Lebanon and Hezbollah's threats. How do you see the situation improving in the next few months, if improving at all?
Well, yes. Well, I think what Netanyahu is following has to do with the election in Israel. As well as to increasing the tensions with Iran, because they're seeing that the negotiation is taking place between Iran and European countries, and they might succeed in some terms probably in future, and that's why they are worried about this. And I think they will try to continue this situation for some time to the future. To the negotiations between Iran and the European sides.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Aslani. So this overall conversation, what it seems to be a consensus amongst all of us here is that no matter what the situation is in terms of who the National Security Advisor, and I'm asking you this, Mr. Murid, the consensus seems to be that at the end of the day, it's pretty much President Trump calling the shots, deciding how he wants to take foreign policy forward. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that. It's the decision, the ultimate decision rests with the President of the United States on these talks on national security and foreign policy particularly. So I don't think that Mr. Bolton's departure as national security advisor will make any difference regarding his policies on North Korea, Iran, or the Taliban in Afghanistan, because he is the ultimate decision maker, and he has a lot of other advisors who are going to be advised on these issues.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Murid. Here I'd like to introduce another guest who's just joining us. It's Mr. Stephen Nagy, a senior associate professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies in the International Christian University in Tokyo. So, Mr. Nagy, welcome to Newswire. We're talking about essentially whether Mr. John Bolton, as the National Security Advisor, the third one to lose this job, does this have any impact at a time where President Trump, campaigning already for the 2020 elections, on these promises, which he previously also campaigned on, of getting out of costly wars, is it going to have any kind of effect on this?
Well, we're not sure who is driving the White House car in terms of national security policy. Whether it was John Bolton in a more measured way, trying to curb President Trump's foreign policy instincts and lack of experience, or was it President Trump's retreat diplomacy, really engaging in some kind of erratic foreign policy? And at this stage, we really don't know. But going forward, I think that the Trump presidency is very much thinking about re-election. And in terms of re-election, the issue that has momentum and broad support is the strong and denuclearizing North Korea. I think that most citizens see this as not something that can be achieved in the short term. And I think President Trump himself has made the calculation that if he wants to be reelected, his national security policy is going to have to focus on the issue that most Americans do have some kind of understanding, and that's North Korea.
So, but at the same time, what we see is President Trump, in the past year alone, has made a lot of statements where he talks about getting his troops out of these wars, these senseless, costly wars. And he's done this with Syria. He's been, these peace talks with Taliban have been going on for a year now. And similarly, his attempts with North Korea. Now, we know that there is a sort of difference in opinion that existed between how John Bolton approached foreign policy and his take on it, and how President Trump moving forward. Do you see any hope in these places where there is a current standoff with the U.S.?
So in my view, I think that foreign policy in general, in terms of troop withdrawal, it will actually just will be a continuation of the current policy that was by and large adopted by the Obama administration. And when President Trump feels that he can gain some political capital, that he may engage in beefing up of troop presence or some kind of tactical missile launch, as we saw in Syria after the chemical weapons were used on civilians during President Xi's visit. I think his view is, how can he use these issues strategically to bolster his position to be reelected? And with that, I don't think there's a strategic long-term approach in terms of thinking about the military, rather than a tactical, momentary approach that sees these as political opportunities rather than, a long-term strategy.
Okay, Mr. Stephen Nagy there, thank you so much for taking out the time to speak. Let me welcome another guest who's joining us, political analyst, Mr. Tereza Novotna. Welcome to Newswire. We're talking about whether now that John Bolton is out, we are going to see a little change in how foreign policy was being dealt by the U.S., especially, let's do a parallel here, the way President Trump took on North Korea, the way he dealt with Kim Jong-un. And we saw recently with Kim Jong-un's latest barrage of rockets that they've test launched, and then also said that we are ready to negotiate. So do you think there's going to be a softening on how they approach Iran?
Obviously, this is just a speculation, but I would think that it's possible that President Trump's approach will be a little bit less hardline, or let's say it will go more in the direction not everything or nothing, but more in terms of, let's do some kind of partial agreement first, step-by-step approach, which has always been the way how the North Koreans wanted to do things. But that at the same time doesn't mean that the final destination, the final goal, the let's say the fully verified denuclearization will change, but perhaps the methods how to reach it may really soften a little bit.
Because the debate really has been about how this method is probably what is causing the most problems. President Trump's approach of my deal or no deal hasn't really helped. Sanctions upon sanctions on Iran has just made them dig their heels even deeper.
Yes, indeed. It's interesting with President Trump's approach that obviously he wanted to do something totally new, something different than all his predecessors have done. And therefore he went to the sort of the top-down approach, which to some extent makes sense in dealing with North Korea, because they're really the buck stops at the very top, right? Every decision is made at the very top. But then when it comes to actual implementation, the American approach hasn't changed much, right? So we still see pressure on sanctions, pressure on the international community, including Europeans, to keep up sanctions, and so on. So now the question is, will the kind of the summit-like approach also trickle down to the more working level arrangement or not? And with the departure of John Bolton, I see a little bit of a chance that this may happen.
There's a chance that might happen. Thank you so much, Ms. Novotna, taking time to speak to us. And also, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Feingold, for sticking through this and giving us your input. We've come to the part of the show where we have to say goodbye because we've run out of time. We will be seeing you next week. Till then, goodbye.